The heavy sound of the prison doors slamming shut echoed through the cold, sterile walls, a sound that felt like an inescapable trap closing around Nathaniel Harper. The weight of the iron gates settling behind him was a constant reminder of the years he'd already spent in this hellish place. He stood still for a moment, staring ahead, his chest rising and falling as his breath grew heavier with the realization of what was about to happen. His hands, rough and calloused from years of physical labor, trembled ever so slightly, betraying the anxiety he could not hide. Sophia, his daughter, stood just a few feet away. At 5 years old, she was too young to understand the cruel reality that separated them. She only saw a man in prison clothes, the father who had disappeared from her life. Her wide, innocent eyes locked onto his, her small face streaked with tears, and Nathaniel's heart cracked with sorrow. He hadn't seen her in 3 long years. He hadn't been able to hold her, comfort her, or tell her he loved her. Now, here she was, standing in front of him, as if he had never left. "Daddy." Her voice trembled as she took a cautious step toward him, her small hands reaching out as though she could somehow bridge the chasm of distance between them. Nathaniel's throat tightened, and his voice was raw with emotion as he spoke. "Please, just let me hug her. Just once." His eyes, desperate and pleading, locked with the warden's. But the guards, standing rigid beside him, didn't budge. Their faces were expressionless, hardened by years of maintaining order within these concrete walls. The warden, a tall man with a weary expression, stood back and observed the scene quietly. His eyes darted between Nathaniel and Sophia, unsure of what to do. He had followed the rules of this place for years, rules that said no contact with loved ones, no moments of tenderness or humanity. But something in Nathaniel's eyes, the raw desperation, the longing in his voice, made the warden pause. He had seen many prisoners come and go, but none like this. After a long silence, the warden sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead as if the weight of the decision was too much to bear. "All right," he said, his voice softer than before. "One hug, but make it quick." Nathaniel's heart surged with hope as the guards reluctantly loosened their grip on him, just enough for him to step forward. He didn't hesitate. In one swift movement, he took a step toward Sophia, who ran into his arms as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The warmth of her tiny body against his chest was overwhelming. Nathaniel closed his eyes, squeezing her tightly, as if he could hold on to this moment forever. Her little fingers grasped at the fabric of his prison uniform, pulling herself into him with all the strength she had. For the first time in 3 years, Nathaniel felt alive again. He could feel her heartbeat against his, her breath against his neck. And for just a fleeting moment, the world outside this prison didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was holding his daughter again. But that fleeting moment of peace shattered in an instant. A sharp scream rang out, a sound so sudden it made Nathaniel's heart stop. His eyes flew open, his body tensing as the guard closest to him gasped in horror. Chaos erupted around him. People scrambled, shouting orders, rushing to pull Sophia away from him. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at his daughter. Sophia's small body trembled violently in his arms. Her breath grew shallow, ragged, and then, just like that, she went limp. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "Sophia?" His voice cracked as he shook her gently, but she didn't respond. Her little frame was growing colder in his arms. He could feel her slipping away. "Sophia!" he shouted, his voice thick with panic as he held her tighter, unwilling to let go. The guards rushed forward, roughly prying his daughter from him, but Nathaniel held on, fighting with everything he had. "No! What's happening to her?" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. But the guards didn't stop. They forcibly pulled Sophia from his arms, her small body still limp and unresponsive. They carried her away with the same cold indifference that they treated him. The nurses rushed toward her, their faces grim, and in a blur of motion, Sophia was whisked away toward the infirmary. Nathaniel stood frozen in the middle of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely registered the voices around him, the orders being barked at him, the guards shoving him back toward the cold steel of his cell. All he could think of was Sophia, his little girl. Was she dead? What had happened to her? Who could do something so terrible to a child? The warden, too, stood frozen, his expression unreadable. He had seen many things in his career, but the sight of a child collapsing in her father's arms was a new kind of horror. "Get him back to his cell," one of the guards barked, dragging Nathaniel away. His mind was a blur, his body moving on autopilot as he was pushed down the sterile hallways of the prison. His feet shuffled along the cold floor, but all he could think about was his daughter, Sophia. Was she going to be okay? He was shoved back into his cell, the door slamming shut with a loud clang. The cold concrete floor met him as he collapsed, his hands gripping the bars of his cell. His breath was ragged as the images of Sophia's limp body, the panic in her eyes, replayed in his mind. Was she still alive? Where had they taken her? The prison, once a place of bitter isolation, now felt suffocating. Nathaniel was trapped in this world of concrete and steel, unable to protect the one thing that mattered most. All he had ever wanted was to see his daughter again, to hold her, to tell her he loved her. And now, he didn't know if he would ever get the chance to do so again. 3 years ago, the town of Redwood Grove had been the type of place where everyone knew each other, where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. It was a small, tight-knit community, the kind where neighbors greeted one another by name, and the local diner always had a warm cup of coffee waiting for you. It was a place where people felt safe, and the thought of something terrible happening seemed as far away as the horizon. But then, everything changed. The day Benjamin Moore, the local police officer who had served his town with dedication and integrity for over 15 years, was arrested. It was a shock to everyone, especially to those who had known him as more than just a cop. He wasn't just an officer, he was a part of the town's fabric. He had helped elderly people cross the street, handed out candy to the children during Halloween, and volunteered at the local shelters. Benjamin was the type of man who stopped and helped no matter the time or circumstance. So when the news broke that he had been convicted of a crime so heinous that it rocked the town to its core, no one wanted to believe it. "I can't believe it. He would never do something like that," Mrs. Callahan, the bakery owner, whispered to the regulars in her shop, shaking her head in disbelief as she handed over a loaf of freshly baked bread. "Ben's a good man. This is all a mistake." But the evidence was there. It was irrefutable. And despite the town's collective disbelief, the wheels of justice ground forward, dragging Benjamin Moore into a nightmare he could not escape. The courtroom was packed the day of the trial. People stood in the hallways, waiting to hear the fate of a man they once called a friend. The judge, the jury, even Benjamin's own lawyer, they all looked at him with pity. There was no one who believed in his innocence. They had already decided before the trial even began that he was guilty. At the back of the courtroom sat Grace Moore, Benjamin's wife, her face pale, her hands gripping the arms of the chair as if trying to hold on to something real. Her 4-year-old daughter, Emily, sat quietly beside her. Emily didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, her small hand wrapped around the hem of her mother's dress. her innocent eyes wide with confusion. When the verdict came in, guilty, the silence that followed felt deafening. Benjamin didn't react. He didn't try to protest or argue. He didn't raise his voice or demand justice. He simply turned to look at his daughter, his eyes filled with pain. Emily's tiny fingers clutched the edge of his jacket, the fabric gripped tightly in her little hand. It was the last time he saw her before being dragged away. 3 years had passed since that moment, and now here he was, locked away in a prison cell, far from his family. His life had been reduced to nothing. For years, he had fought to prove his innocence, but the world had already made up its mind. He was a criminal, a man who had betrayed his badge, betrayed his community, and betrayed the trust of his family. It didn't matter that Benjamin was innocent. No one would listen. Inside the cold, solitary walls of his cell, Benjamin's nights were filled with sleeplessness and nightmares. The whispers from guards and other inmates echoed through the halls, whispers of disgrace and shame. Everyone around him believed he was guilty, and the idea that anyone would fight for his innocence seemed like a distant dream. But then, one day, he received a letter. The handwriting was delicate, careful, as if the person who had written it was afraid of making a mistake. The letter read, "Daddy, I miss you. Mommy says I can visit you. Can I hug you?" Benjamin stared at the words for what felt like hours. His eyes traced every letter, every curve, as if the simple words could bring him back to the life he once knew. The longing in his heart grew stronger with each passing second. It was a simple note from his daughter, but it felt like a lifeline. For 3 years, he had been locked away, his heart aching for her. And now, here was her voice, reaching out to him. The thought of seeing her again, holding her in his arms, was both a blessing and a curse. What would she think of him? Would she still recognize him? Would she be afraid of the man behind bars? His mind raced with questions, but one thing was certain. He had to see her. He had to hold her. The day of the visit came, and Benjamin barely slept the night before. His thoughts swirled with anxiety and hope. The prison was cold and unwelcoming, but the thought of seeing Emily, of feeling her in his arms again, was all that mattered. He was led to the visiting room, his heart pounding in his chest. And there she was. Emily had grown since the last time he saw her. She was taller now, her golden hair a little longer, her face a little older, but her eyes, the same big, bright eyes, were filled with hope. As soon as their eyes met, Benjamin knew in that moment that no matter what happened, no matter how much time had passed or how much pain he had endured, he would do anything to protect her. He would break every rule, defy every law, just to keep her safe. Emily ran toward him, throwing herself into his arms without hesitation. Her small fingers clutched his prison uniform as if she was afraid he would vanish if she let go. Benjamin closed his eyes, holding her as tightly as he dared, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest. In that moment, the prison walls didn't matter. The bars didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was holding his daughter once again. But then, something went horribly wrong. A scream echoed through the room. One of the guards gasped, and chaos erupted. Benjamin felt the small body in his arms begin to tremble. Sophia was slipping away. She was going limp, her breath shallow. His heart sank as panic flooded through him. "Sophia!" he cried out, but it was too late. She was pulled from his arms, and the room descended into chaos. In an instant, the nurses and guards rushed toward her, their faces grim. Benjamin fought to reach her, to hold her, but it was useless. They pulled her away, and just like that, she was gone. In the cold, dimly lit cell, Benjamin Moore sat motionless, his back pressed against the stone wall as he stared blankly ahead. His body ached from the struggles with the guards, his mind still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. His daughter, Emily, had collapsed in his arms. He could still feel the way her small body went limp, the terror in his veins as he screamed her name in desperation. The guards had ripped her away from him, taking her to the infirmary. But what had happened? Why had she collapsed so suddenly? What was wrong with his little girl? Minutes had passed, or was it hours? Time felt irrelevant inside these walls, where every second dragged on endlessly in the silence of isolation. Benjamin tried to push the questions from his mind, but they gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve. What if she didn't make it? What if he never got the chance to hold her again? The fear of losing Emily haunted him like a shadow, but even worse was the gnawing suspicion that something wasn't right. His daughter, the girl who had run to him with nothing but hope in her eyes, hadn't just collapsed by accident. Someone had done this to her, and Benjamin knew exactly who was behind it. The day before, he had received a letter from Emily. It was simple, full of innocence, a message of love from the daughter he hadn't seen in 3 years. But now, that letter felt like a cruel joke. If someone had been able to poison his daughter, what did that mean for the rest of their lives? No, this wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure he was left helpless, and it was more than just a warning. It was a message. As he sat there, grappling with the nightmare that was unfolding, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Officer Grant, a young guard with a tough exterior, unlocked the door to his cell. Grant was no friend, but Benjamin had learned to recognize the small signs of sympathy in the man's eyes. The prison was full of men who had given up their humanity, but there were a few who still had it. "Moore," Grant said quietly, his voice just above a whisper, "the warden wants to see you." Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. The warden? What could the warden want now? Was there news of Emily? His pulse quickened at the thought. Without a word, he stood and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the corridor as Grant led him to the warden's office. When they arrived, the door opened with a soft creak, and Benjamin was ushered inside. The warden, Henry Thomas, was sitting behind a large wooden desk. His tired eyes met Benjamin's, and for a moment there was something there, something that resembled regret, but also something more, something colder. "Sit down," the warden said, his voice calm but firm. Benjamin took a seat, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't speak, waiting for the warden to explain why he had been summoned. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the truth, or if he was ready for whatever came next. The warden leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. "I'm not going to lie to you, Moore. What happened today, what happened to your daughter, it's something we weren't prepared for. It doesn't make sense." Benjamin's mind raced. "What do you mean? What's happened to Emily? Is she okay?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, his expression hardening. "Your daughter was poisoned. She wasn't sick when she came in. She was fine. But by the time she reached you, something changed." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "We don't know how it happened, but we're doing everything we can to save her." Poisoned. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Benjamin's mind reeled. Who would do this to her? Why? The warden's face darkened. "We don't know yet. But this is bigger than you think, Moore. There's someone behind this. Someone with a plan. And I fear that you and your family are caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than just a simple crime." Benjamin felt his stomach twist as he leaned forward in his chair. You think I'm being set up? Who would go to this length? Why harm my daughter? Thomas looked at him with grim determination. I don't know the answer yet, but we're investigating, and we need your help. Benjamin's heart skipped again. What do you want me to do? The warden hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if weighing something in his mind. You've been telling us you're innocent. If that's true, we need you to work with us. If you can help us track down who did this, who's behind all of this, we might be able to stop them before it's too late. Benjamin's thoughts raced. He couldn't afford to trust the system that had condemned him. The world had turned its back on him long ago. But the warden was right about one thing. His daughter's life was on the line. And there was no way he was going to let anyone, especially not the ones who had framed him, hurt her. All right, Benjamin said, his voice steady. I'll help you. I'll do whatever it takes to find out who's behind this. The warden stood up from his desk, his eyes cold but resolute. Good. Because if we don't stop this now, there's no telling what will happen next. At that moment, Benjamin knew that the battle for his freedom wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about something far more dangerous. Someone had manipulated the system to trap him, and now they were coming after his family. But as long as he was breathing, he wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the life of the only person who mattered, his daughter. The air in Benjamin Moore's cell felt thicker than ever, heavy with the weight of his thoughts. His mind raced in 1,000 directions at once. His daughter was fighting for her life, poisoned by forces he still couldn't comprehend. And the only way he could protect her was to find out who was behind it. But to do that, he needed to escape this prison. And that was going to be no easy feat. As the door to his cell rattled open, Officer Grant stepped in. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the far corner of the room where Benjamin sat, his mind swirling with his next steps. I'm going to need your help, Benjamin said, breaking the silence before Grant could speak. You said there were people who could help me out of here, people who think I'm innocent. I need to escape. Grant took a deep breath and stepped closer, lowering his voice. The warden's not the only one who's starting to believe you more. But getting you out of here isn't going to be easy. The people behind all of this, they're dangerous. And I'm not sure you'll make it if you're not careful. Benjamin looked up at him, determination clear in his eyes. I don't have a choice. My daughter is in danger. Whoever did this to her, they're not going to stop until they've finished their job. I can't stay here any longer. I need to protect her. Grant nodded reluctantly, a look of concern flashing in his eyes. There's a transport leaving tomorrow night. They're moving inmates to another facility. If you get yourself on that van, you'll be outside these walls. That's your best chance. Benjamin stood up, his pulse quickening at the possibility. How do I get on that van? Grant hesitated for a moment, his gaze darting around the cell as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. You'll need to make it look like an accident, something that'll distract the guards long enough for you to slip away. We've got a window of about 10 minutes, but that's all. Once that van starts moving, you're on your own. Benjamin's mind clicked into action as he processed the information. And if something goes wrong? Grant's face darkened. If it goes wrong, you'll be dead. These guys don't mess around. You'll have one shot more. Benjamin's fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't afraid. He had nothing left to lose. He'd spent 3 years trapped in this nightmare, fighting for his innocence, fighting for his daughter. And now, he was fighting to escape it all. The following day was a blur. The usual routine of the prison carried on as if nothing had changed, but Benjamin couldn't stop thinking about the plan that was unfolding. Every moment brought him closer to freedom. Every step felt like a risk, but it was one he had to take. As the evening crept in, Benjamin's nerves were frayed. He barely ate, and when the guards came to escort him to his cell, he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the van, the escape, and the danger that was waiting for him beyond the prison walls. That night, the transport van arrived, parked just outside the prison gates. Benjamin had no time to hesitate. He was escorted to the vehicle along with several other inmates, each one being loaded into the back of the van. The guards were distracted for a moment, dealing with paperwork, and that's when Benjamin made his move. His heart raced as he darted into the back of the van, moving quickly and quietly. He had already planned his escape route. The guards were too busy to notice the small diversion that was about to unfold. Benjamin reached under the seat of the van, where a small package of supplies had been hidden earlier, thanks to Grant's help. He pulled out the items quickly, carefully, trying not to draw attention. He had to make it to the back door. Once he was outside, he would be free. But as the van's engine roared to life, something unexpected happened. The guards began to move toward the back of the van, likely checking the paperwork or making sure everything was in order before they left. Benjamin froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to be caught now. Not after all this. He slid to the side, crouching low, making himself as small as possible. The van jolted forward, and for a moment he thought he was going to be caught. He had to get out, and he had to do it now. The van began to pick up speed as it left the prison gates, and Benjamin knew his chance was slipping away fast. Then, without warning, the van stopped. The guards shouted something, and Benjamin didn't wait for any more instructions. He seized his moment and bolted from the back of the van, his pulse pounding in his ears. He heard the shouts of the guards behind him, but he didn't dare look back. He sprinted through the shadows, following the rough path Grant had mapped out for him. He was running, heart racing, fear and adrenaline flooding his system. The sounds of the guards chasing him grew louder, but Benjamin pushed forward. He had to make it to the rendezvous point. There was no turning back now. As he reached the edge of the prison grounds, Benjamin spotted a black car parked near the guard towers. The engine was running, and the headlights flickered in the distance. The driver, hidden in the shadows, was waiting for him. The car's window rolled down slowly. "You made it," a familiar voice said. It was Grant. His face was tense, but there was a look of relief in his eyes. "Get in," he urged, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Benjamin jumped into the car without hesitation, and as the vehicle peeled away from the prison, he knew he had made it. For the first time in 3 years, he was free. But even as he breathed in the cool night air, there was a sinking feeling in his stomach. The war wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. He had escaped the walls of the prison, but there were far greater walls waiting for him in the outside world, and the ones who had put him in here were far from done with him. The car sped through the night, the tires screeching as Grant pushed the pedal to the metal, racing toward safety. Benjamin sat in the passenger seat, his hands gripping the armrest, eyes darting nervously around as they flew past the darkened roads. He had made it out of prison, but now the real danger was beginning. The freedom he had fought for felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that the people who had framed him were still out there, still watching. "Where are we going?" Benjamin asked, his voice hoarse with tension. His mind raced. He had been planning this escape for days, weeks even. But now that it was happening, he felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. His daughter's life was still hanging in the balance. Emily was still in danger. Whoever had poisoned her wasn't just after him. They were after his family. Just trust me, Grant replied, keeping his eyes focused on the road ahead. I've got a place lined up, a safe house. It's close. We'll lay low for a bit, figure out what the hell's going on, and then we'll go from there. But right now, the most important thing is you stay out of sight. Benjamin nodded, barely able to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to spill over. He had done it. He had escaped. But the anger that coursed through him now was far stronger than the relief. His mind kept returning to that moment in the prison visiting room when he held Emily in his arms, only to have her torn from him, her life now hanging by a thread. He wasn't going to let them win. He couldn't. Grant's voice interrupted his thoughts. You've got to be careful. There are people out there who know you're out now. They won't hesitate to come after you. But there's something else you need to know. Benjamin raised an eyebrow, his heart sinking at the weight in Grant's voice. What do you mean? Who's after me? Grant hesitated before answering, his hands tightening around the wheel. You were set up more, and it's bigger than just the robbery. There's someone pulling the strings, someone powerful. They want you out of the way, and they've been watching you for a long time. Benjamin's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Grant, someone who had once been part of the system, made it all the more real. Who is it? Who's behind this? Grant didn't answer immediately. The car slowed down as they turned off the highway and into a quiet street, then parked in front of a small, inconspicuous house. The lights were off, but the door was cracked open, as if someone was waiting for them. Inside, Grant said, his voice tight. We need to talk. Once inside, the door shut behind them, and Grant immediately locked it. Benjamin looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. The house was small, with a single window looking out onto the street. It felt like the kind of place where people hid when they had no other choice. Who are these people? Benjamin asked, taking a seat at the small kitchen table as Grant motioned for him to sit. Grant took a deep breath, clearly struggling with what he was about to say. They've got connections everywhere more. Inside the prison, inside the system, even in the higher levels of law enforcement. You don't know who you're up against. This isn't just a few corrupt cops, it's a whole network. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Benjamin's mind spun. What do they want from me? Grant met his eyes, his face grave. They want you to disappear more. They want you gone. They've been watching you, and now that you've escaped, they're going to move quickly. They've already put a hit out on you. The words hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. A hit? His thoughts turned to his daughter. Was this how they planned to get to him? If they couldn't keep him locked up in prison, they'd come after him. After Emily. This wasn't just about revenge for the robbery. This was personal. Who are they? Benjamin demanded. Who's running this? Grant's face darkened as he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. There's one name you need to know. Monroe. He's the one behind all of it. Monroe. The name sent a shiver down Benjamin's spine. He had heard whispers in the prison, stories of a man who controlled everything from the shadows, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the prison walls. Monroe was a ghost, a puppet master pulling the strings of everyone around him. But why had he targeted Benjamin? Grant's voice broke through Benjamin's thoughts. Monroe's been running the show for years. He's got people everywhere, inside the police department, the courts, even the prison system. And if you want to find out who's really responsible for framing you, you'll have to go through him. Benjamin's mind raced. If Monroe was the mastermind behind everything, then he was the key to understanding why Benjamin had been framed, why his life had been destroyed. But taking him down would be no easy task. "We have to stop him," Benjamin said, determination flooding through him. "We can't let him control everything. I'm not going to let him hurt my family any more than he already has." Grant nodded. "That's the plan. But we can't do it alone. Monroe's got too many eyes watching us. We need help." Benjamin sat back, his eyes narrowing with thought. "I've been running for years, Grant. I've been watching, waiting. And now, it's time to take the fight to him. We'll expose him. We'll make him pay for everything." But even as he spoke the words, Benjamin knew the truth. This wasn't just a battle for his freedom. It wasn't just a fight for justice. It was war. And Monroe was going to learn that Benjamin Moore wasn't the kind of man who went down quietly. The safe house was far from comforting, even with its dim, flickering lights and the steady hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Benjamin sat at the small kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly together as he processed everything Grant had told him. Monroe was the mastermind behind everything, the conspiracy that had framed him, the poisoning of his daughter, and now, the threat against his life. Everything had led him to this one chilling truth. The enemy wasn't just a rogue cop or a group of criminals. It was a powerful hidden network that spanned far beyond the reach of the law. The question that plagued him, however, was how far this network stretched. How many more people were involved in Monroe's game? Who could he trust now? And who was secretly playing for the other side? Grant had left to make contact with a few of his connections, people who had worked outside the official channels and who might know more about Monroe's empire. As Benjamin sat alone, waiting for the next move, a sense of dread began to settle in. The shadows felt closer now, closer than they had ever been in the prison, where the bars had been his only cage. Outside, there were no walls, no limits, but the fear was the same. Someone was watching him, and he knew it. He could feel it in the air, thick with the tension of impending danger. The phone on the kitchen counter buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat as he jumped up and grabbed it. The number was unrecognized, but his instincts told him it wasn't random. He swiped the screen, answering without hesitation. "Benjamin Moore," came a voice, low and smooth. The kind of voice that sent a chill down your spine. "I assume you're not dead yet?" Benjamin's blood ran cold. It was the voice of someone he didn't know, someone far too calm to be trustworthy. But there was no mistaking the words. The man on the other end of the line was no stranger to his situation. "I'm still alive," Benjamin replied, his voice sharp, despite the rising fear. "Who is this?" The man on the line chuckled, a sound that made Benjamin's skin crawl. "You don't know me, Moore, but I know you. I know everything about you. I know where you've been, what you've done, and what's coming for you next." Benjamin's grip tightened on the phone, his mind racing. Whoever this was, they were involved in the bigger picture, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Monroe's network wasn't just a shadow. It was a monster, a vast machine that could strike from any direction. "What do you want?" Benjamin asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What I want," the voice on the other end mused. "It's simple. I want you to know that you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. Monroe doesn't take kindly to people like you, people who escape, people who disrupt his plans. You've made a powerful enemy, and trust me, you'll pay for it." The line went dead with a sudden click, leaving Benjamin standing there, holding the phone in stunned silence. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as the weight of the threat settled over him. He had suspected it before. Monroe wasn't just out for revenge. He was a force, a shadow that controlled everything around him. And now he had Benjamin in his sights. Benjamin's fists clenched as he put the phone down. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a race against time. If Monroe had agents everywhere, inside the police, the prison, maybe even in the town where he grew up, then no one was safe. The thought made Benjamin sick to his stomach. He couldn't trust anyone. Not anymore. But as he turned away from the counter, the door creaked open. Grant walked in, his face grim, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Benjamin. The air between them felt heavier now, thicker with the weight of everything they were up against. "What happened?" Benjamin asked quickly, stepping forward. Grant didn't speak right away, his gaze still wary. "I've made contact with a few of my old sources. They told me something that doesn't sit right. Monroe, he's got someone on the inside, someone who's been keeping track of everything. Your escape. It was expected." Benjamin's stomach twisted at the words. It wasn't just a coincidence that they were being hunted. It was a part of Monroe's plan all along. They had been tracked, watched, every step calculated. "So what now?" Benjamin asked, his voice low. "We need to move. The safe house isn't safe anymore. Monroe's people are already on their way." Grant's words were clipped, urgent. "We don't have much time." Benjamin's heart raced, his mind already shifting into action. There was no more time to waste. Monroe's network was too vast, too intricate. The only way to survive now was to go on the offensive. But how? How could he strike back when the enemy was always one step ahead? Grant's expression softened slightly, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. "There's someone who can help us. An old ally. She's got resources, connections we can use. We need to get to her before they find us." Benjamin nodded, his mind working quickly to put together the pieces of the plan. "Let's go. We don't have much time." The two men quickly gathered their things. Benjamin felt the weight of the task ahead of him like a heavy burden. His daughter was still in danger. Monroe was out there, watching, waiting for his next move. And now, Benjamin had no choice but to step into the shadows and take the fight directly to Monroe's doorstep. The car ride was tense, the silence between them heavy with the realization of what was at stake. Every turn, every stoplight felt like it could be their last. But they couldn't afford to be afraid. Not anymore. As they pulled up to the nondescript building where Grant's contact was waiting, Benjamin's heart pounded. The streets were empty, quiet, eerily quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the trap had already been set. "We're here," Grant said quietly, glancing around nervously. "Stay alert. We don't know who's on the other side." Benjamin's hand moved instinctively to the gun hidden beneath his jacket, his mind already preparing for the worst. But there was no turning back now. Monroe was coming for them, and the only way to stop him was to find out everything. The truth, the players, and how to bring them all down. The building that Grant had brought them to was nothing special. It was tucked away between two larger buildings in the heart of the city, almost hidden in plain sight. The street was quiet, empty, with only a few scattered cars parked along the curb. As Benjamin stepped out of the car, his instincts went on high alert. He could feel eyes on him, whether from the shadows or from the windows of the surrounding buildings, he couldn't be sure. Monroe had eyes everywhere. Even now, as he made his way to the door, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. Grant was already walking toward the entrance, a determined look on his face. He didn't knock. Instead, he simply swiped a key card through the reader beside the door, and it clicked open with a low hum. Without a word, He motioned for Benjamin to follow. Inside was a different world. The lights were bright, the air thick with the smell of fresh coffee and paper. It was an office, though not like any Benjamin had seen before. The walls were lined with shelves filled with documents, maps, and digital monitors flickering with information. But what caught Benjamin's attention the most was the woman sitting behind a desk, her eyes scanning through files as if she had all the time in the world. She looked up when they entered, her expression unreadable. She was in her mid-30s, sharp features framed by dark, straight hair, wearing a black leather jacket and jeans. There was a calm confidence in her demeanor, the kind that came from years of surviving in a world full of lies and shadows. Her eyes locked with Benjamin's, and for a brief moment, he felt a sense of recognition. "I'm guessing you're the man of the hour," she said, her voice cool but welcoming. "Grant's told me a lot about you." Benjamin nodded, his unease still lingering in the pit of his stomach. "And you are?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "Name's Sasha. I've been keeping an eye on things for a while. We've got a mutual friend in high places." She paused, eyeing him closely. "You're in deeper than you think. But we can talk about that later. For now, you need to hear what I've got." Sasha motioned toward a set of chairs by the desk, and Benjamin sat, waiting for her to explain. Grant, standing beside him, gave him a reassuring nod, though the tension in his jaw was hard to miss. Sasha clicked a button on the desk, and a monitor on the wall flickered to life, displaying a series of images and documents. Benjamin's heart sank as he saw them. Photos of Monroe, standing with other figures Benjamin didn't recognize. There were pictures of different high-profile meetings, confidential documents, and encrypted communications that linked Monroe to multiple criminal operations across the country. But there was something else. Something Benjamin hadn't expected. One of the images showed a picture of Ryan Carter, Benjamin's former partner. His face was unmistakable, even though it was partially obscured in a blurry shot taken from across the street. He was standing next to Monroe, exchanging what appeared to be a large envelope. "Ryan," Benjamin muttered under his breath, the shock of seeing his old friend in bed with the enemy nearly knocking the wind out of him. His pulse quickened, the room around him beginning to spin. "Yeah, your old friend Ryan Carter," Sasha said, her tone grim. "He's been working for Monroe for years. He's the one who planted the evidence on you, the one who made sure everything went smoothly to frame you. And it gets worse. Ryan's not just any cop. He's been feeding Monroe intel for months, possibly years." Benjamin's mind reeled. Ryan? The same man who had stood beside him, who had sworn to have his back during their time on the force? The same man who had promised they would stick together no matter what? How could he have turned on him so completely? "How could he do this?" Benjamin asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. "I thought Ryan and I were brothers. How could he betray me like this?" Sasha leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "That's what I need you to understand. Ryan didn't do it out of personal gain, not entirely. There's more to it. Monroe's influence stretches far and wide. He's got a hand in nearly every criminal operation in this country, and Ryan's been feeding him information to protect his own skin. He got too deep, and now he's part of the machine. Monroe's people don't get out once they're in." The gravity of Sasha's words hit Benjamin like a hammer. Everything he had known, everything he had trusted, had been shattered. Ryan wasn't just a cop, he was a traitor, a cog in a machine that was built to destroy everything Benjamin stood for. The fact that his old partner was the one who had set him up made the betrayal even more personal. But there was more. As the images continued to flash on the screen, Sasha pulled up a document that made Benjamin's stomach drop. This, she said, is the reason you were framed. It's all about control. Monroe needed you out of the way because he's got a much bigger plan. He was testing you more. All of this, the robbery, the planted evidence, the poisoning of your daughter, it's been part of a larger scheme to get you out of the picture. He's orchestrating something even bigger. And now that you're out, he's going to make his move. Benjamin's blood ran cold as he scanned the document. It was a list of names, code words, and dates, like a twisted, organized blueprint for chaos. As his eyes traced the text, it became clear. Monroe's plans were far more extensive than just one man's downfall. Monroe's been setting up a massive heist involving high-level officials, law enforcement, and even politicians. The robbery you were convicted for? It was a test run. The real job is coming, and if you don't stop him, it's going to devastate the entire country, Sasha continued, her voice low, as if she were revealing a dark secret that had been buried for years. Benjamin's mind was spinning. He had spent 3 years rotting in a cell for something he didn't do, and now the truth was finally coming to light. Monroe hadn't just been targeting him, he had been setting the stage for something far more dangerous. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about power, control, and a plan that could change everything. "We need to stop him," Benjamin said, his voice a low growl. "We need to stop all of this before it's too late." Sasha nodded, her eyes sharp and calculating. "And that's exactly what we're going to do. But we need a plan. Monroe's not just some thug. He's a shadow, and he's going to strike when you least expect it." Benjamin clenched his fists, his resolve solidifying. The truth had been revealed. The time for running was over. It was time to bring Monroe down, to make him pay for everything he had done. But to do that, Benjamin knew it would take more than just fighting back. It would take everything he had. And he was ready. Benjamin's mind raced as he processed the gravity of what Sasha had just revealed. Monroe wasn't just some criminal mastermind hiding in the shadows. He was a force, an invisible hand pulling the strings of everything Benjamin had known. What had seemed like a simple setup to ruin his life had now escalated into something much larger, something far more terrifying. The heist wasn't just a robbery. It was a precursor to something catastrophic, something that could tear apart the very fabric of the country. As he sat there, listening to Sasha outline the scope of Monroe's plan, Benjamin couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Every second counted now. He had already lost 3 years of his life. He couldn't afford to lose any more. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but time was running out. If they didn't act fast, Monroe's plan would unfold, and there would be no stopping the damage. Sasha leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. She had been in this world for a long time, long enough to see the true danger behind every decision. Benjamin could see that she wasn't just a bystander. She was a player, a strategic mind in a world of chaos. And now, it seemed, she was offering him a chance to fight back. "We can't take Monroe down head-on," Sasha said, breaking the silence. "He's too powerful, too well-connected. He's got people in every corner of this country, police, politicians, businessmen, and criminals. If we're going to stop him, we need to do it carefully. We need leverage, and we need to find the weak points in his operation." Benjamin nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. "So, what's the plan?" Sasha's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You don't get to play a game like this without getting your hands dirty. But first, we need to get Monroe's attention. We need to draw him out, make him feel like we're not just after him. We're after his empire." Benjamin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And how do we do that? Sasha paused for a moment before responding. There's someone Monroe trusts, someone close to him. Carlos Reyes. He's Monroe's enforcer, his right hand. If we can get to Reyes, we can force Monroe to act. And once we've got him, we use him to get to the rest of the network. Benjamin's stomach churned at the mention of Reyes's name. He had heard rumors in prison about the man, rumors of his brutality, his ruthlessness. Reyes wasn't just a thug. He was a killer, a man who could take down anyone who crossed Monroe. He was the muscle behind Monroe's empire, and if they were going to have any chance of surviving this, they had to get to him first. How do we get to Reyes? Benjamin asked, his voice steady despite the growing fear inside him. Sasha's smile widened slightly. Leave that to me. I have my connections. But it's going to be risky. Reyes isn't an easy man to find, and Monroe doesn't trust anyone outside his inner circle. If we make one wrong move, it could be the end of everything. Benjamin knew the risks, but what choice did he have? Monroe was coming for him and his family. His daughter was still fighting for her life, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. The clock was ticking, and the longer they waited, the harder it would be to take down Monroe. We don't have time, Benjamin said firmly. We need to move now. Sasha nodded. All right, I'll set things up. But you need to stay out of sight. If Monroe knows you're free, he'll come after you with everything he's got. Benjamin couldn't afford to hide anymore. He had spent 3 years in a cell, hiding from a crime he didn't commit. Now, it was time to fight back. I'll do what I have to. I'm not running anymore. Sasha's eyes softened, but the seriousness in her expression didn't fade. I know, but just remember, this isn't a game you can win by playing by the rules. Monroe doesn't play fair, and neither can we. Benjamin stood up, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for Monroe to come for him. Not this time. He had lost too much already, and now the only thing left to lose was the fight. Hours later, Benjamin sat in a darkened corner of the safe house, watching as Sasha made contact with her network. She was in constant communication with people who had information on Monroe's movements, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every second felt like it could be their last. If they were discovered, if Monroe found out that Benjamin was alive, they would have no chance. Finally, Sasha turned to him. We've got a lead on Reyes. He's been spotted in the city, at a warehouse on the outskirts. We don't have long before he leaves, but we can make it there in time. Benjamin's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The moment they had been working toward. If they could get Reyes, they could get to Monroe. And if they could get to Monroe, they could finally end this nightmare. Let's move, Benjamin said, his voice low but filled with conviction. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a flickering lamp near the door. The place smelled like old wood and oil, the kind of place that looked abandoned but still held a sense of danger in the air. Benjamin's heart raced as he and Sasha approached, their footsteps quiet on the gravel outside. They had to be careful. Reyes wouldn't be alone. He'd be surrounded by Monroe's men, and they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Sasha gave him a quick glance, her hand on the gun holstered at her side. "Stay sharp," she whispered. "This is it." Benjamin nodded, his own hand on his weapon. They couldn't afford to fail. As they reached the door, Benjamin's pulse quickened. The fight was about to begin. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going down without a fight. The cold, damp air of the warehouse clung to Benjamin's skin as he crouched behind a stack of crates, his eyes scanning the shadows. The building was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of distant machinery and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing from the other side. This was it, the moment when everything would change. If they could get to Carlos Reyes, they would have the leverage they needed to bring down Monroe. But that was a big if. Reyes wasn't just a pawn in Monroe's empire. He was the enforcer, the one who did the dirty work, the one who made sure no one crossed Monroe without paying the price. Benjamin could feel the weight of the gun at his side, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle. He wasn't a killer, not by nature, but he had been forced to play a part in this game. And now, with everything on the line, he had no choice but to keep moving forward. Sasha was by his side, just a few feet away, her eyes locked on the door where Reyes had been last seen. She had done her part, finding the lead, contacting her network, tracking Reyes to this warehouse. Now it was up to them to make sure they didn't waste it. The danger was palpable. Monroe's men were everywhere, hidden in the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. But the element of surprise was on their side. For now, at least. "Stay quiet," Sasha whispered, her voice barely audible as she gestured toward the door. "He's inside. We need to move fast." Benjamin nodded, taking a deep breath. The plan was simple. Get inside, find Reyes, and get out before Monroe's men had a chance to react. But simplicity never worked in situations like this. Everything could go wrong in an instant. Sasha pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as they slipped inside. The warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulbs hanging above. The walls were lined with shelves and crates, most of them covered in dust and cobwebs. But through the haze of uncertainty, Benjamin could make out figures in the shadows, moving carefully, their eyes sharp, alert. Monroe's men were here, and they were on high alert. Benjamin's heartbeat picked up as they crept deeper into the warehouse. Every step felt like a lifetime. He couldn't afford to make a sound. He had to stay focused. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Then, just as they rounded the corner, they saw him. Carlos Reyes stood in the center of the warehouse, flanked by two of Monroe's men. His broad shoulders and intimidating presence were hard to miss. He was talking to someone on a phone, his voice low and controlled, but Benjamin could hear the anger in his words. Reyes wasn't just a thug. He was a strategist. He was the one who made things happen. The kind of man who didn't hesitate when it came to violence. Benjamin knew they didn't have long. If they didn't act now, Reyes would be gone, and their chance to stop Monroe's plan would slip away. Sasha motioned to him, signaling for him to move closer. They had to close the distance between them and Reyes before it was too late. With every step, Benjamin's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the gun at his side, the tension in his muscles, the fear that threatened to overcome him. But he forced it all down. He had a job to do. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about saving his daughter, about stopping Monroe before it was too late. Sasha's hand shot out, grabbing Benjamin's arm and pulling him to the side. A faint sound, a door creaking open, rang in his ears. They weren't alone anymore. Benjamin froze. The door to the far side of the warehouse had just opened, and more men stepped inside. He could hear their footsteps, the soft shuffle of boots on the floor. They were closing in. If they were going to make their move, it had to be now. "Get Reyes. I'll handle the others," Sasha whispered, her eyes meeting his with determination. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He knew what needed to be done. He had to stop Reyes, and then they could make their escape. But the next few moments were crucial. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. He drew his weapon and moved forward, low to the ground, careful not to make a sound. He couldn't let Reyes slip away. As he closed in on the man, his eyes locked onto the back of Reyes's head. He could feel the tension in the air, the threat of violence hanging over him. Reyes turned just as Benjamin was about to step into position, his eyes locking onto Benjamin's for a split second. In that moment, Benjamin knew that the element of surprise was gone. The gunshot rang out. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat, but it wasn't his gun. It was Sasha. She had fired first. One of Monroe's men had fallen to the ground, a bullet through his chest. "Move!" Sasha shouted, and Benjamin didn't need any further encouragement. He surged forward, rushing toward Reyes, who had pulled out his own gun. The two men collided in the middle of the warehouse, the sound of grunting and the clatter of metal filling the air as they struggled for control. Reyes was strong, far stronger than Benjamin had expected. The man was a monster in every sense of the word. His fists were like sledgehammers, his grip iron-tight. But Benjamin had one advantage. He had nothing left to lose. His body was fueled by adrenaline, by the need to protect his daughter, to stop Monroe from destroying everything. In the struggle, Benjamin managed to land a solid punch to Reyes's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. But it wasn't enough. Reyes countered with a sharp elbow to Benjamin's face, sending him stumbling backward. Just as Reyes lunged for him, trying to land a finishing blow, Benjamin saw the flash of Sasha's gun. The shot rang out, and Reyes's body slumped forward, his grip on his own weapon faltering. Benjamin quickly grabbed the gun from his hand, pointing it at Reyes's chest, his heart still racing. Reyes let out a low chuckle, blood dripping from his lips. "You're too late," he rasped, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Monroe's already won. There's nothing you can do to stop it." Benjamin's grip tightened on the gun. He knew he had to finish this, once and for all. The warehouse was eerily quiet now, save for the soft drip of blood from Carlos Reyes's mouth, pooling on the cold concrete floor. His once proud frame was now crumpled, and though he had spoken those final words with arrogance, Benjamin knew the truth. Reyes was defeated. But the fight wasn't over. Benjamin stood over the man, his gun still trained on Reyes's chest. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The air around him was thick with danger. There was no telling how many more of Monroe's men were nearby, waiting for their chance to strike. Sasha moved in swiftly, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. "We need to go," she said, her voice cold, her gaze still fixed on the door. "Monroe's going to send more men. We don't have time." Benjamin nodded, holstering his gun and stepping away from Reyes's body. His mind was still racing, adrenaline coursing through him. He had never imagined he would come face to face with Reyes, the man who had been Monroe's enforcer. He had expected danger, but not like this, direct, brutal, and close. But now that Reyes was down, their path was clear. "Where's the exit?" Benjamin asked, his voice low, his senses on high alert. Sasha pointed toward the far end of the warehouse. "There's a back door. It's a long shot, but it might be our best bet. Let's move." They moved quickly, staying low and using the shadows to their advantage. The dim light of the warehouse offered some cover, but it also made it harder to see who might be lurking just beyond their sight. Benjamin's mind kept returning to the urgency of the moment. Monroe. They had taken down Reyes, but Monroe wasn't a man who would let such a blow slide. He would retaliate, and when he did, it would be swift and unforgiving. As they reached the back door, Benjamin's hand gripped the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. They had almost made it, almost escaped the warehouse. But just as he was about to push the door open, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and growing closer. Sasha's eyes locked onto his. They know we're here. Benjamin didn't waste time. He threw the door open and bolted outside, Sasha right behind him. The cool night air hit him like a slap in the face, and for a moment he felt a flicker of hope. Freedom was within reach, but the sound of engines revving cut through the night like a warning shot. Black SUVs appeared at the end of the street, their headlights cutting through the darkness, closing in on them. Monroe's men had found them. "Get in the car!" Sasha shouted, pointing toward a nearby sedan parked by the side of the road. Without thinking, Benjamin sprinted toward the car, jumping into the passenger seat as Sasha slammed the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and they sped off, tires screeching on the asphalt. But as they drove through the narrow streets, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The pursuit was relentless. The SUVs were gaining on them, their headlights illuminating the path ahead like a pair of ghosts. Sasha swerved the car sharply, taking a tight corner, but the SUVs followed, undeterred. "We need to lose them now," she muttered, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Benjamin gripped the door handle, the tension rising in his chest. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when he was so close to bringing Monroe to his knees. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just about his escape anymore. It was about survival. And he wasn't going to let Monroe win. Sasha took another turn, this time heading toward a deserted alley. But before they could get very far, the sound of screeching tires rang out from behind them. One of the SUVs had caught up, and before Benjamin could react, the car jerked violently as the back door flew open. Two of Monroe's men emerged, weapons raised. "Get down!" Sasha yelled, ducking to the side as gunfire erupted through the back window. Benjamin instinctively reached for the gun hidden beneath his jacket, returning fire. The bullets flew, the sound of gunshots deafening in the confined space of the car. He hit one of the men in the chest, sending him sprawling backward, but the other was still firing relentlessly. Sasha maneuvered the car, swerving to avoid the next wave of bullets. Benjamin leaned out of the window, firing again, this time hitting the second gunman square in the shoulder. The man collapsed back into the SUV, and the vehicle swerved before it careened off the road and into a nearby wall. "Keep driving," Benjamin shouted, his heart pounding in his ears. Sasha's hands were steady on the wheel, but Benjamin could see the strain in her eyes. They weren't out of the woods yet. The sound of more engines roared in the distance. Monroe wasn't going to stop sending his men after them. This fight was far from over. They turned onto a narrow side street, the cars following closely behind. Benjamin felt the adrenaline kick in again, this time with purpose. They had lost Reyes, but not the battle. They had made a dent in Monroe's operation, but there was so much more to uncover. Sasha didn't speak as they raced through the streets, but Benjamin knew she was thinking the same thing. Monroe would come after them with everything he had, and this time they needed to be ready. "We have to go to the next step," Benjamin said, his voice grim. "We can't keep running forever. We need to end this. We need to take Monroe down for good." Sasha nodded, her face hardening. "I've got a plan. But we'll need help. And we need to hit him where it hurts. No more playing games." Benjamin clenched his jaw, determination flooding his veins. He wasn't running anymore. This was his fight, and he was going to finish it, no matter what.